Hello and welcome to the next reading of the book The Bridge on the River Kwai. Now, the last two videos, chapters 1 to 2 and 3 to 4, I've just realised that that's part 1 of the book, and there's 7 chapters in part 1. So tonight I shall read chapters 5, I would normally read 5 and 6, but then I realised in the next video it would be the last chapter of part 1 and the first chapter of part 2. So this will conclude part 1 of the book with the 3 chapters 5, 6 and 7. And then I shall work out how many chapters there are in part 2 and organise it accordingly. So, chapter 5 of part 1 for the bridge on the River Kwai. After half an hour's beating up, the colonel was thrown into a hut where there was neither bed nor chair, so that he was forced to lie down in the damp mud on the floor when he felt too tired to stand up. For food he was given a bowl of rice heavily laced with salt, and Saito warned him that he would keep him there until he decided to obey orders. For a week the only person he saw was a Korean sentry, a brute who looked like a gorilla, that's an interesting description, who on his own initiative added still more salt to the daily rice ration. But he forced himself to swallow a few mouthfuls of it, and after gulping down the whole of his meagre ration of water, he would then lie down on the floor and try to disregard his hardships. He was forbidden to leave the cell, which consequently became as offensive as a cesspit. At the end of a week, Clipton was at last given permission to visit him. Shortly before, the M.O. had been summoned by Saito, whom he found wearing the sullen expression of an anxious tyrant. He could see that he was wavering between anger and fear, which he did his best to mask behind a cool tone of voice. "I am not responsible for all this," he said. "The bridge across the river has got to be built, and a Japanese officer can't afford to put up with heroics. Try and make him understand that I don't intend to give in. Tell him that thanks to him all his officers are having the same treatment. If that's not enough, his men will have to bear the consequences of his pig-headedness as well. So far, I haven't interfered with you or with those on the sick list. I've been kind enough to let them off all duties. I shall regard this kindness as a sign of weakness unless he changes his mind." He dismissed him with this threat, and Clipton was taken in to see the prisoner. He was at first horrified by the condition to which the CO had been reduced, and by the physical deterioration which his body had undergone in such a short time. The sound of his voice, which was barely audible, seemed to be a distant, muffled echo of the tone of authority which the M.O. remembered. But this metamorphosis was only superficial. Colonel Nicholson's spirit had not changed at all, and the words he uttered were still the same, although delivered in a different tone. Clipton, who had fully intended to persuade him to give in, now saw there was no chance of that. He soon exhausted all his carefully prepared arguments, then fell silent. The colonel did not even answer him, but simply said, "Please let the others know that I'm still quite adamant. On no account will I have an officer from my battalion working like a navvy." Clipton left the cell, torn once again between admiration and anger, a prey to painful indecision, unable to make up his mind whether he should worship the CO as a hero or regard him as a complete fool. He wondered whether it would not be best to ask God to crown this dangerous lunatic with a martyr's halo and admit him into his kingdom as quickly as possible, so as to prevent him from turning the River Kwai camp into a scene of frightful tragedy. What Saito had said was no more than the truth. The treatment being meted out to the other officers was only 1 degree less inhuman, while the men were made regular targets for the brutality of the guards. As he walked away, Clipton thought of the danger that threatened his patients. Saito must have been waiting for him, for he rushed up, his eyes betraying genuine anxiety as he inquired, "Well?" He was quite sober and looked rather depressed. Clipton tried to judge how far the Colonel's attitude was likely to make the Jap lose face, then pulled himself together and decided to take a firm line. "Well, it's like this. Colonel Nicholson won't give in to force, nor will his officers. And in view of the way he's being treated, I could not advise him to do so." He protested against the conditions of the prisoners in detention, quoting the Hague Convention as the Colonel had done, arguing from his professional point of view as a doctor, and finally from the simple humanitarian point of view, even going so far as to declare that such monstrous treatment was tantamount to murder. He expected a violent reaction, but none came. Saito merely muttered that the Colonel was to blame for the whole business, and then abruptly walked off. At that moment Clipton felt inclined to believe that he was really not such a bad man at heart, and that his actions were all due to fear of one kind or another. Fear of his superiors, who were probably badgering him about the bridge, and fear of his subordinates, in whose eyes he was losing face through his obvious inability to exact obedience. His natural inclination to generalize led Clipton to identify this combination of two fears, the fear of superiors and of subordinates respectively, as the main source of all human calamities. As he put this idea into words, he felt that somewhere or other he had once come across this very psychological maxim. This gave him a certain sense of satisfaction, which helped to allay his anxiety. He developed this train of thought a little further, but was brought to a stop on the threshold of the hospital by the realization that every calamity, even the worst in the world, could be attributed to men who had neither superiors nor subordinates. Saito must have thought the matter over. His treatment of the prisoner was more lenient during the following week, and at the end of which he went to see him and asked if he had finally decided to behave like a gentleman. He had arrived in a reasonable frame of mind, intending to appeal to the Colonel's common sense, but faced with the latter's refusal to discuss a question which was already cut and dried, he again lost his temper and worked himself up into a state of hysterical frenzy, in which he could hardly be taken for a civilized human being. The Colonel was again beaten up, and the gorilla-like Korean received strict orders for the harsh regime of the first few days to be resumed. Saito even struck the guard as well. He was no longer responsible for his actions when seized by these fits, and he accused the man of being too soft-hearted. He rushed about the cell like a raving lunatic, brandishing a pistol, and threatening to use it on the guard as well as the prisoner in order to enforce a little discipline. Clipton, who once more tried to intervene, also came in for a few blows, and his hospital was cleared of all patients who were still capable of standing upright. They were forced to drag themselves to the building yards and shift heavy loads, otherwise they would have been beaten to death. For several days terror reigned over the River Kwai camp. Colonel Nicholson's answer to his ill treatment was a stubborn, haughty silence. Saito's personality seemed to switch from that of a Mr. Hyde, capable of every kind of atrocity, to a comparatively humane Dr. Jekyll. Once the period of violence was over, a regime of extraordinary leniency succeeded it. Colonel Nicholson was allowed to draw not only full rations, but also a supplementary scale, normally earmarked for the sick list. Clipton was given permission to see him and attend to him, and Saito even warned him that he held him personally responsible for the Colonel's health. One evening Saito had the prisoner brought into his room and then ordered the escort to dismiss. Alone with him, he asked him to sit down and drew from his stores a tin of American corned beef, some cigarettes, and a bottle of liqueur whiskey. He told him that as a soldier he felt a deep admiration for his attitude, but war was war even though neither of them was responsible for it. Surely he could understand that he, Saito, was obliged to obey the orders of his superior officers. Now these orders stated that the bridge across the River Kwai was to be built as quickly as possible. He was therefore compelled to make use of all the personnel available. The colonel refused the corned beef, the cigarettes, and the whisky, but listened with interest to what he had to say. He calmly replied that Sato had not the foggiest idea of how to tackle a work of such importance. He had reverted to his original arguments. It looked as though the squabble was likely to go on forever. No one on earth could have told whether Saito was going to discuss the matter sensibly or give vent to another hysterical outburst. He was silent for some time, while the question no doubt was being debated on some supernatural plane unknown to mere mortals. The colonel took advantage of this and said, "May I ask you, Colonel Saito, if you're satisfied with the work so far?" The insidious question might well have tipped the scales on the side of hysteria, for the work was progressing badly, which was one of Colonel Saito's major worries, since his career was at stake as much as his reputation. But this was not the cue for Mr. Hyde. He looked foolish, hung his head and muttered some inaudible reply. Then he put a full glass of whisky into the prisoner's hand, poured a large one out for himself, and said, "Look, Colonel Nicholson, I don't think you've really understood. There's no need for us to be at loggerheads. When I said all the officers were to work, naturally I never meant you, the commanding officer. My orders only applied to the others." "Not one of my officers will work," said the colonel, putting his glass back on the table. Saito suppressed a gesture of annoyance and concentrated on keeping calm. "I'd been thinking the matter over during the last few days," he went on. "I think I could put majors and above on administrative duties. Only the junior officers would then have to lend a hand." "None of the officers will do any manual labour," said Colonel Nicholson. "An officer must be in command of his men." At this Saito could control himself no longer. But when the colonel returned to his cell, having successfully stuck to his guns in spite of bribes, threats, blows, and even entreaties, he felt that the situation was well in hand, and that it would not be long before the enemy capitulated. Chapter 6. The work was at a standstill. The colonel had touched Saito on a raw spot when he asked how the task was progressing, and he was proved right in his forecast that the Japanese would eventually have to yield through sheer necessity. 3 weeks had gone by, and not only was the bridge not yet under way, but the preliminary preparations had been handled so ingeniously by the prisoners that it would take considerable time to repair all the damage that had been done. Infuriated by the treatment meted out to the CO, whose courage and endurance they had admired, fretting under the torrent of curses and blows which the sentries rained down on them, indignant at being employed like slaves on work which was useful to the enemy, feeling all at sea now that they were separated from their officers and no longer heard the familiar words of command, the British soldiers competed with each other to see who could be the slackest, or better still, who could commit the most elementary blunders under an ostentatious show of keenness. There was no punishment sufficiently severe to curb their insidious activities, and the little Japanese engineer was sometimes reduced to tears of desperation. The guards were too thin on the ground to superintend all of them, and too stupid to spot the culprits. The layout of the 2 stretches of line had to be started all over again at least 20 times. Both the straight sections and the curves, which had been accurately computed and pegged out by the engineer, would relapse as soon as his back was turned into a maze of disconnected lines diverging at sharp angles, at which he would afterwards cry out in despair. The 2 bits on either side of the river, which the bridge was eventually meant to connect, were palpably at a different level, and never ended up directly opposite each other. One of the squads would then start digging furiously, and succeed in producing a sort of crater which dipped far lower than the level required, while the fool of a guard would gaze with delight at the sight of such feverish activity. When the engineer turned up, he would lose his temper and beat guards and prisoners indiscriminately. The former, realizing that they had been fooled once again, would take their revenge, but the harm had been done, and it took several hours or several days to repair it. One squad had been ordered to cut down some trees as timber for the bridge. they would make a careful selection and bring back the most twisted and brittle ones they could find, or else devote considerable effort to felling a giant tree which would subsequently tumble into the river and be lost. Or again they would choose trunks which were eaten away inside by insects and collapsed under the slightest weight. Saito, who carried out a daily inspection, gave vent to his fury in increasingly stormy outbursts of temper. He dispensed curses, threats and blows, swearing even at the engineer, who would answer back with the retort that the fatigue parties were absolutely useless, at which he would scream and swear louder than ever and try to think of a new form of punishment to put an end to this sullen resistance. He made the prisoners suffer more than if he had been an embittered jailer left to his own devices and scared stiff of being sacked for inefficiency. Those who were caught red-handed in an act of wilful damage or sabotage were tied to trees, beaten with thorn branches and left out in the open for hours, bleeding and naked, exposed to the ants and the tropical sun. Clipton saw the victims as they came back in the evening. They were carried in by their pals, shaking with fever, their backs stripped raw. He was not even allowed to keep them on the sick list for long. Saito did not forget who they were. As soon as they were capable of standing, he sent them back to work and ordered the guards to keep a special eye on them. The moral fibre shown by these bad hats was so moving that Clipton sometimes found himself in tears. He was amazed to see them take such punishment. There was always at least one of them who, when he was alone with him, would find the strength to sit up with a cheerful wink and whisper a few words in a language that was gradually gaining currency among all the prisoners in Burma and Siam. The effing bridge still isn't built, Doctor. The effing Emperor's effing railway still hasn't got across the effing river in this effing country. The effing CO's right. He knows what he's talking about. If you see him, tell him we're all for him. The effing baboon hasn't heard the last of the effing British Army. The most brutal forms of punishment had achieved no result whatever. The men had got used to them. The example set by Colonel Nicholson was a stimulant even stronger than the beer and whisky which they no longer had to drink. If one of them was ever punished beyond the limits of human endurance, and could only go on working at the risk of his life, there was always another ready to relieve him. This was a recognised routine. In Clipton's opinion, they were even more to be praised for refusing to be taken in by the mealy-mouthed promises which Saito made during those fits of depression when he realised he had exhausted every known form of torture and was incapable of inventing others. One day he made them parade outside his office, having ordered them to stop work earlier than usual, so as not to overtire them, he explained. He issued them all with rice cakes and fruit bought from the Siamese peasants in the nearest village, a gift from the Japanese army to spur them on to greater efforts. He abandoned all sense of shame and positively grovelled in front of them. He prided himself, he told them, on being one of them, just an ordinary sort of chap whose only wish was to do his duty with as little fuss as possible. Their officers, he pointed out, were making them all work twice as hard by refusing to work themselves, so he fully understood how resentful they must feel and did not hold it against them. On the contrary, in order to show his sympathy for them, he had on his own authority reduced the individual quota of work on the embankment. The engineer had fixed this as 1.5 cubic yards of earth per man, while he, Saito, had decided to make it 1 cubic yard. He was doing this because he felt sorry for them in their present condition, for which he himself was not to blame. He hoped that, in view of this kindly gesture, they would cooperate with him and speed up this easy work, which would help to bring the damn war to an end. He was almost pleading with them by the time he had finished, but his prayers and entreaties had no more effect than his curses and blows. Next day the quota was fulfilled. Each man conscientiously dug up and carted off his cubic yard of earth, some even more, but the distance they carried it was an insult to the meanest intelligence. Saito was the first to yield. He was at the end of his tether. The prisoner's sustained resistance had reduced him to a pitiful condition. He spent the days preceding his final downfall prowling about the camp with the same desperate look in his eye as a beast at bay. He even went so far as to ask the young subalterns to choose for themselves what work they wanted to do, promising them special privileges and extra rations. But they all stood firm, and since a high-level Japanese inspection was imminent, he resigned himself to ignominious surrender. He prepared to make one last desperate bid to save face and cover up his defeat. But this pathetic attempt did not even deceive his own men. The 7th of December 1942, being the anniversary of Japan's entry into the war, he announced that in honour of the occasion he had undertaken to grant a general amnesty. He had an interview with the colonel and told him he had adopted a measure of extreme benevolence. All officers would henceforth be exempt from manual labour. In return for this, he trusted they would devote themselves to supervising their men's activity so as to ensure the maximum efficiency. Colonel Nicholson replied that he would see what could be done. Now that the situation was established on a proper constitutional basis, there was no longer any reason for trying to oppose the enemy programme. As in every civilised army, the officers, it went without saying, would be responsible for the conduct of their men. This was total surrender on the part of the Japanese. That evening the victory was celebrated in the British camp by a sing-song, cheers, and an extra rice ration, which had been issued with the greatest reluctance on Saito's orders as a further gesture of goodwill. That same evening the Japanese colonel retired earlier than usual, wept for his loss of face, and drowned his sorrows in a bout of solitary drinking, which lasted well into the night until he slumped dead drunk onto his bed, a state which he hardly ever managed to reach except in unusual circumstances, for he had an amazingly strong head and could normally stand the most barbaric mixtures. Chapter 7. Colonel Nicholson, accompanied by his usual advisers, Major Hughes and Captain Reeves, went down to the river along the railway embankment on which the prisoners were at work. He walked slowly. He was in no hurry. Immediately after his release he had scored a second victory by obtaining 4 days off duty for his officers and himself by way of compensation for their unjust punishment. Saito had clenched his fists at the thought of this further delay, but had given in. He had even issued orders for the prisoners to be decently treated, and had bashed in the face of one of his own soldiers whom he had caught smiling sarcastically. If Colonel Nicholson had applied for 4 days' exemption from duty, it was not only to recover his strength, it was also to give him time to think, to sum up the situation, to hold discussions with his staff, and draw up a plan of action, steps which every conscientious commander should take instead of rushing bald-headed at the easiest solution, a thing he hated doing more than anything else in the world. It did not take him long to spot the outrageous mistakes intentionally committed by his men. Hughes and Reeves could not suppress a cry of admiration when they saw the astonishing results of this activity. "That's a fine embankment for a railway line," said Hughes. "I suggest you put the culprits up for a decoration, sir. Just think of an ammunition train trundling over that lot." The colonel did not even smile. "A splendid job, sir," echoed Captain Reeves, the ex-public works engineer. "No one in his senses could possibly imagine they intend to run a railway over this switchback. I'd sooner face the Japanese army all over again than take a trip along this line." The colonel looked as solemn as ever and asked, "In your opinion, Reeves, your opinion as a technician, could this be put to any use at all?" "I don't think so, sir," Reeves answered after a moment's reflection. "They'd do better to abandon this mess completely and build another line a little further up." Colonel Nicholson looked more and more preoccupied. He nodded his head and moved on in silence. He wanted to see the whole of the building yards before forming an opinion. He reached the river. A squad of about 50 men, stark naked except for the triangle of cloth which the Japanese call working kit, were milling about on the stretch under construction. A guard with rifles slung marched up and down in front of them. Some of the squad were engaged on digging a little further away, while the remainder were busy collecting the earth on bamboo carriers and spreading it out on either side of a line marked out with white pegs. This had originally run at right angles to the bank, but the insidious genius of the prisoners had succeeded in shifting it so that it was now almost parallel to the river. The Japanese engineer was not on the spot. He could be seen on the opposite bank, gesticulating in the middle of another squad, who were taken across the river every morning on rafts. He could also be heard. "Who set out that line of pegs?" the colonel asked, coming to a standstill. "He did, sir," said the British corporal, springing to attention and pointing to the engineer. "He set it out, but I helped him a little myself. I made a slight improvement as soon as he left. He and I don't always see eye to eye, sir." And since the sentry was not looking, he gave a conspiratorial wink. Colonel Nicholson did not acknowledge this secret message, but remained deep in thought. "I see," he said in a voice as cold as ice. He moved on without further comment and stopped in front of another corporal. This one, with the help of a few men, was devoting considerable effort to clearing the ground of a number of large roots by heaving them up to the top of a slope instead of pitching them down the side of the bank, while another Japanese guard blankly looked on. "How many are at work in this squad today?" the colonel asked in ringing tones. The guard gaped at him, wondering if it was in order for the colonel to speak like this to the prisoners, but his voice held such a note of authority that he did not dare move. The corporal at once sprang to attention and began to stammer a reply. 20 or 25, sir. I'm not quite sure. One man went sick as soon as we arrived. He suddenly felt dizzy. I can't think why, sir, for he was perfectly all right at Reveille. 3 or 4 of the lads were needed, of course, to carry him to hospital, sir, as he couldn't walk by himself. They haven't come back yet. He was the biggest and the toughest chap in the squad, sir. As it is, we shan't be able to get through our quota today. There seems to be a curse on this railway." "A corporal," said the colonel, "ought to know exactly how many men he has under him. What is the quota, anyway?" "A cubic yard of earth per man per day, sir, to be dug and then carted away. But with these damn roots and all, sir, it looks as if it's going to be too much for us." "I see," said the colonel, as coldly as ever. He moved off, muttering under his breath through clenched teeth. Hughes and Reeves followed behind him. They went to the top of a rise, from which they could see the river and the whole of the surrounding countryside. At that point the Kwai was over 100 yards wide, with both banks high above the level of the water. The colonel studied the ground from every angle, then turned to his two subordinates. What he had to say was obvious, but he said it in a voice which had recovered all its former tone of authority. "These people, the Japanese, have only just emerged from a stage of barbarism, and prematurely at that. They've tried to copy our methods, but they don't understand them. Take away their model, and they're lost. They can't even do the job they've taken on here in this valley, yet it doesn't need much intelligence. They don't realise they'd save time by planning in advance instead of rushing bolt-headed at the thing. What do you think, Reeves? Railways and bridges are in your line, aren't they?" "You're quite right, sir," said the captain, instinctively warming to his subject. "I've tackled at least a dozen jobs like this in India. With the material available in the jungle and the personnel that we've got here, a qualified engineer could build this bridge in under 6 months. There are times, I'm afraid, when their incompetence simply makes my blood boil." "I agree," said Hughes. "I can't help it, but I sometimes feel like screaming at the sight of such inefficiency. You'd think it was quite simple to—" "What about me?" the colonel broke in. "Do you think I'm pleased with this scandalous state of affairs? I'm absolutely appalled by what I've seen this morning." "Well, anyway, sir," laughed Captain Reeves, "I don't think we need worry about the invasion of India if this is the line they say they're going to use. The bridge across the Kwai is not quite ready to take the weight of their trains." Colonel Nicholson was deep in thought, but he kept his blue eyes firmly fixed on his two companions. "Gentlemen," he said, "I can see we'll have to take a very firm line if we want to regain control of the men. Through these savages they've fallen into idle, slipshod habits unbecoming to members of His Majesty's forces. We'll have to be patient with them and handle them carefully, for they can't be held directly responsible for the present state of affairs. What they need is discipline, and they haven't had it. It's no good using violence instead. You've only got to look at the result. A lot of disconnected activity, but not a single positive achievement. These Orientals have shown how incompetent they are when it comes to man management." There was a moment's silence while the two officers wondered what he really meant by these remarks. But they were quite clear. There was nothing to read between the lines. The colonel had spoken in his usual forthright manner. He let his words sink in and then went on. "I must ask you, therefore, and I'll ask all the other officers as well, to show as much consideration as possible at first. But on no account must our patience be stretched to the point of weakness, or else we'll fall to the level of these brutes. I shall also speak to the men myself. As from today we've got to put a stop to this disgraceful inefficiency. We can't have the men going absent on the slightest provocation. The NCOs must answer any question put to them prompt and clearly. I don't think I need remind you of the need for firm action at the first sign of sabotage or malingering. A railway line is meant to run horizontally and not twist about like a switchback, as you so rightly observe, Reeves." And in the next video we shall start part 2.